The relentless conflict between the Apache and Comanche stands as one of the most enduring and brutal struggles in Native American history. These two sworn enemies clashed in what Spanish colonizers in Mexico ominously referred to as a war of extermination. By the late 1500s, the eastern Apache had carved out a dominant position in the southern Great Plains. This region was a land of abundance, lush buffalo hunting grounds complemented by fertile land for agriculture. For the Apache, it offered a balanced existence, blending semi-agrarian practices with access to one of North America's richest food sources. Meanwhile, the Comanche were living a very different reality. Marginalized and pushed into less desirable territories by more powerful groups like the Apache, their existence was precarious. This hardship bred resilience and a burning drive for vengeance, a seed that would later grow into their extraordinary rise to power. The 1500s saw the Spanish, fresh from their conquests in Mexico, setting their sights northward. Driven by a doctrine of conquest, they brought with them the tools of imperialism, steel armor, firearms, and the mighty horse. By the early 1600s, these conquistadors had reached Apache territory, establishing settlements like Taos and Santa Fe. Their method was brutal but systematic: subjugate, convert, and exploit. Native groups were forced into Christianity and labor, echoing the horrors already inflicted across Central and South America. Yet the Apache resisted fiercely. Unlike the Pueblo and other subjugated tribes, they raided Spanish settlements with ferocity, stealing horses and supplies. These raids marked a pivotal moment in Apache history. Observing the Spanish from a distance, the Apache recognized the transformative potential of the horse. By the 1650s, they had mastered horseback riding and began conducting mounted raids. This newfound mobility and speed turned them into a devastating force. Spanish settlements, particularly Taos and Santa Fe, became frequent targets. The Apache struck quickly and retreated into the vast, rugged terrain, leaving devastation in their wake. The Pueblo people, caught between Apache aggression and Spanish incompetence, suffered the most. Their pleas for protection went unanswered, as the Spanish proved unable to defend their settlements effectively. By 1680, Apache raids had pushed the Pueblo people to the breaking point. They revolted against their Spanish overlords, driving them out of New Mexico. In the chaos, thousands of horses, descendants of the Spanish Mustangs, escaped into the wild. These Mustangs, hardy and perfectly adapted to life on the Great Plains, would soon transform the cultural and military landscape of Native America. For the Comanche in particular, the arrival of the horse marked the beginning of an era that would see them rise from outcasts to one of the most powerful tribes in North America. As the 18th century dawned, the Spanish settlements in the southwest continued to endure the relentless raids of the Apache. These raids had defined the frontier for decades. Yet in 1706, something remarkable happened. The attacks suddenly ceased. The Apache, once unyielding in their aggression, began behaving in ways that baffled their Spanish adversaries. Reports from the frontier described an unsettling phenomenon. Entire Apache bands, such as the Jay Carilla and Mescaleros, were abandoning their homes on the plains. Farms and settlements were left to the wind as the Apache fled in haste. The Spanish heard whispers of fierce battles raging beyond their sightlines, but the identity of the enemy remained a mystery. The Apache's mysterious retreat marked the emergence of a formidable new power. By the 1720s, many Apache groups, weakened and disheartened, sought refuge in the rugged mountains. Some, desperate for survival, even approached the Spanish for protection. However, not all were so fortunate. Entire Apache bands, such as the Ferones, Carlones, and Palomas, simply vanished. Their fates were sealed by an adversary so powerful that the Spanish could scarcely comprehend it. The enemy that had decimated the Apache was soon revealed by the Utes, another Native American group. They referred to these invaders as the Comanche, meaning those who are against me all the time. The name encapsulated the unyielding aggression and territorial ambition of the people the Spanish would come to call the Comanche. The Comanche emerged as a phantom menace, striking with speed and precision from the north. Mounted on horses, introduced to the Americas by the Spanish, they harnessed this new mobility to devastating effect. Their tactics were revolutionary, their attacks swift and overwhelming. For the Apache, who were skilled warriors in their own right, the Comanche represented a foe unlike any they had faced before. This transformation of the Comanche, from marginalized outcasts to dominant forces, was nothing short of extraordinary. Their mastery of horseback warfare gave them an edge that the Apache, who still relied on more traditional tactics, struggled to counter. By the time the Spanish truly understood the threat posed by the Comanche, it was too late. The balance of power on the plains had shifted irrevocably. The Apache, in a twist of fate, inadvertently paved the way for their greatest enemy, the Comanche. Historically, the Comanche were often dismissed as unimpressive. Marginalized by stronger tribes, including the Apache, they were pushed to the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains, eking out a meager existence in some of the least desirable lands. Yet their fortunes changed dramatically in the mid-17th century. The catalyst? Horses. The very same horses that had escaped during Apache raids on Spanish settlements and Pueblo villages. These Mustangs, resilient and perfectly suited for the Great Plains, spread rapidly across the region, a phenomenon historians now call the Great Horse Dispersal. While many tribes adopted the horse, the Comanche perfected its use. Unlike others who obtained horses primarily through raids, the Comanche established breeding practices, amassing vast herds. Horses became their currency, their wealth, and their lifeblood. This newfound mobility transformed the Comanche from a marginalized group into a nomadic powerhouse. Unlike the Apache, who were semi-agricultural and tied to their land, the Comanche could roam freely. Their range expanded to an astonishing 400 miles, allowing them to hunt buffalo more effectively and raid with unparalleled efficiency. The Comanche became synonymous with terror on the plains. Their raids were strategically timed, often under the cover of night during full moons, earning this period the chilling moniker Comanche Moon. Settlers lived in fear of their swift and brutal attacks. Murders, tortures, and kidnappings were common. Women and children were taken into captivity, sometimes sold into the thriving slave trade of New Mexico. What set the Comanche apart, however, was their fully mounted warfare. While most tribes dismounted to fight, the Comanche mastered combat from horseback. Their skill was legendary. They could shoot arrows with deadly precision while hanging off the sides of their galloping horses, shielding their bodies from enemy fire. George Catlin, a 19th-century artist and ethnographer, marveled at their horsemanship, describing them as the most extraordinary riders he had ever seen. The Apache, despite their adaptability and ferocity, struggled to counter the Comanche's mobility and tactics. While Apache warriors excelled in hand-to-hand combat on foot, their agricultural lifestyle made them predictable targets. T.R. Fehrenbach captured this dynamic aptly in his book Comanches, A History of a People. It was this very taste for corn that killed them when their land was invaded by true savages on horseback. The Comanche, however, were not driven by a desire for genocide. Their ultimate goal was control over resources, particularly the buffalo-rich plains. Their raids aimed to decimate Apache rancherias, destroy crops, and capture women and children, as Thomas Britton recounts in Light Pan Apaches. The Comanche sought to cripple their enemies economically and strategically. By the early 18th century, the Comanche had inflicted catastrophic losses on the Apache. The once powerful mescaleros and jicarillas retreated to the mountains, while the Light Pan Apache faced near annihilation. One infamous battle, known as El Gran Sierra del Ferrero, epitomized the brutality of this conflict. Over several days, the Comanche decimated the Light Pan, killing warriors and capturing countless women and children. Ultimately, the surviving Apache were forced into harsher environments, mountains and deserts, where they could no longer compete with the Comanche's dominance on the open plains. The decades-long war between the Apache and Comanche left scars not only on the land, but also on the collective memory of Native America. Though many details have been lost to time, the records that survive tell a story of resilience, adaptability, and the devastating impact of technological and tactical superiority. The Comanche's rise to power came at a tremendous cost, not just to the Apache, but to the fabric of life across the plains. By the mid-18th century, the Apache found themselves cornered, hemmed in by the Spanish to the south and the Comanche to the north, who had become a dominant force on the plains. Realizing that direct confrontation was no longer viable, the Apache devised a bold and deceptive strategy to pit their enemies against each other. In 1749, the Apache approached the Spanish in San Antonio, seeking a peace treaty. This was a shocking gesture, as the Apache had been relentless in their raids since the city's founding in 1719. These raids were no minor nuisance. Kidnappings, murders, and the theft of thousands of horses had plagued the Spanish settlers for decades. For the Spanish, the prospect of peace was a godsend. Not only would it end the constant bloodshed, but it also presented an opportunity to expand their influence. The Apache not only promised peace but requested the construction of a mission and presidio in their territory, offering to convert to Christianity, something they had previously resisted. The Spanish eagerly agreed. The mission, however, was not just about spreading religion. Whispers of gold and silver in the region provided an additional incentive. A wealthy Spaniard funded the endeavor, securing a position for his brother, Father Alonso Giraldo de Terreros, to oversee the mission. A seasoned officer, Don Diego Ortiz de Parilla, was tasked with military oversight. In April 1757, a Spanish caravan of priests, 100 soldiers, and over 2,000 animals arrived at San Saba, deep in Apache territory. Yet curiously, the Apache were absent. Despite their promised support, the mission and presidio were constructed 2 miles apart, fortified by wooden palisades. Over the following months, the Apache sporadically visited the mission, making promises to relocate but never following through. Frustration grew among the Spanish, especially as some priests suspected the Apache were exploiting them for gifts. They were right, but the true extent of the deception was yet to be revealed. San Saba was not part of Apache territory. It lay within Comanche land, a fact the Apache cunningly used to their advantage. The Apache had been raiding Comanche camps to the north, spreading rumors that the Spanish were their allies. To inflame tensions further, they planted Spanish tools and shoes in Comanche villages, creating the illusion of collaboration between the two groups. By early March 1758, the Spanish at San Saba noticed a strange silence. Every Apache in the area had vanished. Days later, war cries echoed beyond the walls. Over 60 horses were stolen, and reconnaissance soldiers reported large enemy forces encircling the area. The Comanche had arrived. On March 16, 1758, the Comanche approached both the mission and the presidio. At first, they feigned friendship, gaining entry to the mission alongside allied tribes. The Spanish priests, eager to maintain peace, welcomed them, but the pretense quickly turned to violence. The Comanche slaughtered between 8 to 10 people at the mission, including Father Terreros. They mutilated the dead, set fire to the buildings, and looted supplies. Survivors fled to the better fortified presidio, where the Comanche did not attack. They had made their statement and vanished as quickly as they had come. The massacre left the Spanish humiliated and enraged. The following year, in 1759, Don Diego Ortiz de Parilla led a punitive expedition north to avenge the attack. However, this campaign ended disastrously. The Comanche, well-prepared and strategically elusive, overwhelmed the Spanish. The expedition's failure underscored the Comanche's dominance and the Spanish's inability to impose control on the plains. In 1759, following the devastating San Saba Massacre, the Spanish launched a punitive expedition to assert their dominance and avenge the deaths of their people. Led by Don Diego Ortiz de Parilla, the Spanish force comprised around 1,000 soldiers, including 130 Apache allies and other native auxiliaries. However, this campaign, intended to demonstrate Spanish strength, quickly devolved into a catastrophic failure. The expedition's first misstep occurred when they encountered the Tonkawa people. The Spanish attacked and killed many Tonkawa, despite their lack of involvement in the conflict. This unprovoked aggression not only tarnished Spain's reputation, but also alienated potential allies. As they moved northward, the Spanish reached the Red River in October, where they finally encountered their true target, the Comanche. Unlike the Spanish, the Comanche were prepared. A force estimated to be at least twice the size of the Spanish lay in wait, utilizing their deep knowledge of the terrain and superior mobility. The Spanish, despite their numbers, quickly realized they were outmatched. The Comanche's tactics left no room for error. They controlled when and where engagements would happen, denying the Spanish any opportunity to gain the upper hand. The Apache auxiliaries, fully aware of the Comanche's capabilities, were hesitant to engage, further weakening the Spanish resolve. As tensions mounted, panic set in among the Spanish forces. Before any significant fighting could occur, chaos erupted. Soldiers fled the battlefield, abandoning supplies, cannons, and even their horses. The intended display of strength turned into a humiliating retreat. The Spanish retreated in disarray, their authority on the plains further eroded. This failed campaign underscored Spain's inability to confront the Comanche effectively. For the Apache, the plan to use the Spanish as a buffer against their northern enemies had backfired spectacularly. Not only had the Spanish failed to check Comanche expansion, but they had also proven incapable of defending their own settlements. Within a few years, the Comanche extended their reach even further south, regularly raiding Spanish borderlands. The sparsely populated settlements, scattered across arid landscapes, became easy targets. The Comanche exploited the openness of the plains, avoiding heavily fortified presidios while striking isolated villages with brutal efficiency. The Comanche's reign of terror during this period is vividly described in S.C. Gwyn's Empire of the Summer Moon. Gwyn notes that the Comanche rarely attacked fortified positions, instead preferring surprise attacks on unprotected villages. Their methods were calculated to instill fear and break resistance. They would burn entire settlements, murder or torture inhabitants, and take captives, particularly young women and children, to be sold into slavery or assimilated into their society. They relished surprise, insisted on tactical advantage. They would attack whole villages and burn them, torturing and killing their inhabitants, leaving young women with their entrails carved out. Men burned alive. They skewered infants and took young boys and girls as captives. S.C. Gwyn, Empire of the Summer Moon. The Spanish, burdened by slow-moving troops and an inability to locate their elusive adversaries, were helpless. Punitive expeditions against the Comanche often returned empty-handed, or worse, did not return at all. Whether defeated by the Comanche or the unforgiving plains, the Spanish faced a relentless cycle of frustration and loss. Superior Comanche tactics. The Comanche's ability to dictate the terms of engagement, combined with their mastery of horseback warfare, rendered traditional Spanish military strategies ineffective. Poor coordination. The Spanish campaign suffered from internal disarray. The lack of unity among soldiers, compounded by the reluctance of native auxiliaries to engage, doomed the expedition before it began. Geographical challenges. The vast open plains favored the highly mobile Comanche. For the Spanish, unfamiliar terrain and logistical difficulties further hindered their efforts. Overextension of Spanish forces, Spain's ambitions in the Americas often exceeded its resources, leaving its northern frontier vulnerable to well-organized native forces like the Comanche. The failed expedition against the Comanche marked a turning point in the struggle for control of the southern plains. The Spanish were forced to confront the limits of their power, while the Comanche cemented their reputation as the most formidable native power in North America. For the Apache, the failure symbolized the futility of relying on the Spanish to counter the Comanche threat. As the Comanche pushed further south, they transformed the plains into their domain, leaving a legacy of dominance that would echo through history. The Spanish, meanwhile, retreated into defensive strategies, a tacit acknowledgement of their inability to challenge Comanche supremacy. By the late 18th century, the Spanish found themselves besieged on multiple fronts. The aftermath of the San Saba disaster had left their authority in ruins. Meanwhile, Apache raids resumed, compounding their difficulties. Yet these raids were driven less by malice than by sheer necessity. Forced out of the fertile plains by the Comanche, the Apache could no longer sustain themselves through farming and were compelled to raid for survival. The governor of Texas, Domingo Cabello, captured the dire situation in a 1780 letter from San Antonio. There is no instant day or night when the reports of barbarities and disorders do not arrive from the ranches. Totally unprotected as we are, this can only result in the complete destruction and loss of this province. Faced with relentless attacks from both Apache and Comanche, the Spanish considered a drastic solution, a war of extermination. However, they recognized an opportunity amidst the chaos. the two native powers hated each other. If the Spanish could forge peace with one, they could potentially use that alliance to eliminate the other. Up until 1780, Spanish efforts to communicate with the Comanche had largely failed. That changed under the leadership of Don Juan Bautista de Anza, a military officer and skilled negotiator. De Anza understood that to earn the Comanche's respect, he needed to prove Spanish strength on the battlefield. In an expedition into Comancheria, De Anza employed tactics familiar to the Comanche: rapid mounted warfare. At Greenhorn Peak, he ambushed a Comanche band, catching them off guard and inflicting a decisive defeat. This victory was not only a tactical success, but also a psychological blow to the Comanche, who had underestimated Spanish military capabilities. De Anza followed up this victory with a series of raids, targeting Comanche settlements and warriors. Yet, unlike previous Spanish campaigns, De Anza demonstrated restraint. Captured Comanche were released with a clear message: peace and trade were on the table whenever the Comanche were ready. By 1785, the Comanche had suffered enough losses to reconsider their position. Representatives from several Comanche bands gathered in Taos, where De Anza orchestrated what many historians regard as a diplomatic triumph. Through skilled negotiation, he convinced the Comanche to appoint a single representative to speak on their behalf, an unprecedented act of unity among the fiercely independent Comanche bands. The result was a groundbreaking agreement. The Comanche pledged to cease their attacks on Spanish settlements, open trade relations with the Spanish, assist the Spanish in defeating their shared enemy, the Apache. This was a monumental victory for the Spanish, ending decades of Comanche raids and forging an alliance that would shift the balance of power on the plains. The newfound alliance bore fruit in January 1790, when Spanish General Juan de Ugalde led a joint Spanish-Comanche force against the Lipan Apache. In a canyon west of San Antonio, the Apache were surrounded and overwhelmed. Hundreds of Apache warriors were killed, and the survivors fled into the mountains. The Lipan Apache, once a formidable force, were reduced to fewer than 1,000 warriors. This campaign marked the end of their presence on the plains and symbolized the broader collapse of Apache resistance in the region. Like many other Apache bands, they retreated permanently into the inhospitable mountains, leaving the fertile plains firmly under Comanche control. Diplomatic brilliance. De Anza's ability to unite disparate Comanche bands under a single representative was an extraordinary achievement, demonstrating the value of combining military action with diplomacy. The Comanche's calculated choice. For the Comanche, the alliance with Spain was a strategic move. By aligning with the Spanish, they secured access to trade goods, particularly firearms, while weakening a long-standing rival in the Apache. The Spanish shift to realpolitik, the willingness of the Spanish to ally with a former enemy, against the Apache marked a pragmatic departure from their earlier colonial strategies. The Spanish-Comanche alliance reshaped the power dynamics of the southern plains. For the Spanish, it brought a temporary reprieve from frontier raids, allowing them to stabilize their settlements. For the Comanche, it consolidated their dominance over the plains, further cementing their reputation as the most powerful native force in North America. However, the alliance came at a cost. The Apache, though weakened, retreated to the rugged mountains, where they would continue to resist both Spanish and Comanche incursions. This moment of Spanish-Comanche cooperation was ultimately fleeting, as broader geopolitical changes in the 19th century would erode the power of both groups. By the late 18th century, the Comanche stood as the undisputed masters of the southern plains. Their mastery of horseback warfare, unparalleled mobility, and strategic alliances had solidified their position as the most powerful tribe in North America. The Spanish, recognizing their strength, formed a fragile peace with the Comanche, allowing their settlements to breathe easier after decades of relentless raids. For a time, this peace seemed to stabilize the region. The Apache, once a dominant force, had been driven from the fertile plains, their ability to farm and raid curtailed by Comanche supremacy. Spanish settlements, though still vulnerable, no longer faced the same existential threat from Apache raids. In these natural fortresses, the Apache found new strength. They adapted their strategies, utilizing hit-and-run tactics to harass both the Spanish and the Comanche. These mountains became a bastion of resistance, allowing the Apache to survive and even thrive in an environment where others struggled to follow. History, however, would soon take a turn that neither the Spanish nor the Comanche foresaw. The rise of new powers in North America, the United States and Mexico, brought sweeping changes that would dismantle both Spanish colonial authority and Comanche dominance. For the Apache, who had endured centuries of conflict, these shifts offered both challenges and opportunities. The Spanish, unable to sustain their empire under increasing pressure from revolution and external threats, eventually ceded control of their territories. The Comanche, whose power had relied heavily on their control of the plains and trade networks, faced the encroachment of settlers and militarized campaigns that eroded their influence. Despite the collapse of their enemies, the Apache endured. Their adaptability and resilience allowed them to persist where others faltered. The mountains that had once been their refuge became a symbol of their survival. Even as the broader geopolitical landscape shifted, the Apache's legacy as a people who resisted domination, adapted to adversity, and outlasted their foes remained firmly intact. Yet the story was far from over. The Apache, though defeated on the plains, retreated into the rugged mountains, a terrain that neutralized the Comanche's greatest advantage, the horse. Unlike the wide-open plains where speed and mobility reigned supreme, the mountainous regions favored endurance, guerrilla tactics, and intimate knowledge of the land.